It's one of the oldest, and by most measures, successful political parties in the world. In the 100 years between 1924 and 2024, the British Conservative Party was in power either alone or as part of a coalition for over 2/3 of that time, 67 years compared to a mere 33 for their opponents. In that time, they managed to produce a string of household names: Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, even Boris Johnson. We did say they had to be household names for good reasons. What we're trying to say is that this is less a party than it is an electoral machine, a force that has dominated British politics ever since its emergence in the 1830s until now. At the time of writing in mid-2025, the Tories aren't just sinking below the waves, they're floating toward the bottom of the Mariana Trench, a lifeless corpse already being picked over by the fishes. Public polling shows that the party is popular with just 16% of the UK public, a figure on par with Donald Trump and not much more popular than Vladimir Putin. Of course, all political parties have their ups and downs. Just 5 years ago, Labour were as popular as a porcupine enema, let's say, and now they're in government. But something about this feels different. Rather than just going through a slump, it started to feel like the world's most successful political party might be facing a terminal case of death. Here's why. Now, for outsiders, the UK local elections might seem rather quaint, perhaps even a little bit absurd. Rather than midterms like in America, the British system livens things up a bit between elections by letting voters choose their councils, local bodies that have remarkably few powers and mostly focus on deeply sexy things like waste collection and planning permission. Turnout is often abysmal. Only certain areas vote at certain times, and idiosyncratic issues always play a part. And yet, these elections are watched religiously by pundits for signs of how the next nationwide election will go. Which is why most loyal Conservatives spent May the 2nd this year looking like they'd just been forced to swallow a lemon. To call the most recent local elections apocalyptic for the Tories would be to underestimate the fire and brimstone voters rained down upon them. While the incumbent Labour Party got a battering, the Conservatives lost 676 councillors and control of 16 councils. Now, if you're not British, that last sentence probably a little bit confusing. So I went over to ChatGPT and asked it to explain it via an American sporting metaphor, and this is what we got. They, the Tories, didn't just lose seats. It was like watching a junior varsity team take on the 85 Bears, blindfolded and calling plays from a barbecue menu. And I trust you know what that means, Americans, otherwise ChatGPT has betrayed me. Look, hopefully you Yanks grasp the scale of defeat that we're talking about here. As the local rag, The Spectator, noted, barring the 2019 European Parliament elections, where the party won only 9% of the vote and placed 5th, this can be considered the Conservative Party's worst ever performance in a national election. Now, at this stage, you might be thinking something along the lines of, well, gee, Simon, the Tories recovered from their 2019 battering, so what's to say they won't rise again, huh? And, well, hey, maybe they might. Perhaps following the Tory landslide in 2029, Conservative HQ will be able to dig up this video and absolutely roast the shit out of me on TikTok. But if that's what party leadership is hoping will happen, that suggests a dangerous complacency. Because there are factors at play today in 2025 that suggest the Tories' collapse in popularity is more permanent than they'd like to admit. The first factor is that the party is in opposition. British voters delight in giving the incumbent party a kicking in off-year elections. In 2019, the Tories were both in power and paralysed by fights over Brexit and duly received a pasting. This time, though, it's Labour in power, and while Keir Starmer's party did indeed emerge bloody and bruised, they still play second. Only it wasn't the Tories who beat them, it was a brand new party. Sort of. Reform UK is a new party with a very old lineage. A vehicle for Nigel Farage, it's effectively a reboot of the Brexit Party, which itself grew out of his previous one-man band, UKIP. In this light, it is just the latest iteration of something that's been a part of the British political landscape since at least 2006, when Farage became UKIP leader. Yet it's also the most successful. While the Tories got a mere 15% of the vote in the local elections, Reform got 30%. And this is important for all sorts of reasons. The first is the source of Reform's votes. While Labour appears to be losing nearly 1/10 of its voters to the new populist party, a poll reported in the Times of London showed 1/3 of Tory voters in 2024 had defected to Farage's outfit. The second are how these defections might impact Britain's electoral system. Unlike much of Europe, which uses proportional representation, the UK relies on first past the post to allocate Parliament's 650 seats. In each constituency, the party with the most votes wins, regardless of how close it is. This means you could theoretically have a situation where one party, let's call them the Simonistas, gets exactly one vote more than their rival, the Westlerians, in every single seat, and thus wins total control of Parliament, despite the nationwide vote being effectively split 50-50. Obviously, such an outcome is deeply improbable, but that doesn't mean the system hasn't previously thrown up weird results. In the 2024 election, Labour got less than 34% of the vote, but wound up with 411 seats, almost the same as Tony Blair got in 1997 with over 43% of votes. In 1992, the Tories under John Major received more votes than any other party in UK history, and yet wound up with only a narrow majority. But for this video, the key point is that first past the post makes it extremely hard for new parties to get a foothold. While a new force in, say, Germany might be able to get into the Bundestag with around 5% and start making waves, in Britain, any new party wanting to make a splash needs to either be geographically limited, like the SNP in Scotland, or to reach the tipping point of 30%. As The Times explains, a party crossing a tipping point is where a relatively small increase in vote share can lead to a huge increase in the number of seats won. End quote. Reform now appears to be at that tipping point. And while they are stealing votes from Labour, they're stealing far more votes from the Tories, all of which suggests that a general election held tomorrow might see the new party wipe out the Conservatives in most of their strongholds. Indeed, when The Spectator plugged the Tories' local election results into a swingometer designed to translate them into a nationwide election, it suggested that the world's most successful political party might win as few as 12 seats. 12 out of a total of 650. To put that in perspective, the Tories won 121 seats at the last election, and it was the worst result in their nearly 200-year history. As former Conservative Chancellor Jeremy Hunt later noted, those results could be replicated at a general election. To quote him, "The Conservatives cannot rule out becoming extinct." Of course, it's worth pointing out that Reform could stumble in a nationwide election, that they might fall short of that magic tipping point. But even if that were to happen, there are still signs that the Tories could be doomed. After all, the party isn't only being eaten from its right, it's also being devoured on the left. When Boris Johnson led the Tories to victory in the December 29 general election, the assumption was that this was going to be the start of a long and glorious reign, that Boris would serve at least 2 terms, that Labour would be out of power for a generation, and that British politics had just been permanently realigned. In the event, only one of those things turned out to be true. British politics had changed, but not in the way everyone imagined. The big driver of the Tories' win in 2019 was the defection of Labour voters in the so-called Red Wall, a mostly post-industrial swath in the north of England. These regions had voted Labour for generations, but also backed Brexit and were generally socially conservative. Johnson's gamble was that he could turn them into Conservatives, a gamble so successful that he doubled down on it in government, trying to turn the Tories into something like the Republican Party under Trump, socially conservative, pro-big state, and more working class. The problem? In America, there's no real alternative for disaffected moderate Republicans who would never vote for a Democrat. In Britain, though, there was a centrist third party just ready to step in and hoover up the votes of former Tories disappointed by the pivot. Depending on whose analysis you read, the 2024 election saw the Conservative Southern Blue Wall either weakened or collapsed. Although some of these prosperous, pro-European, fiscally conservative yet socially liberal seats went to Labour, more went to the Liberal Democrats. Nor was this a one-off. At the 2025 local elections, the Lib Dems hoovered up former Tory seats in places like Cambridgeshire, Oxfordshire and Shropshire. Overall, a third of the councillors that the party lost were taken by the Lib Dems. As The Economist helpfully noted, while Mr Farage's gang devour one section of Conservative support, the Lib Dems feast on the other. The reason we bring this up is because it speaks to a deeper problem facing the Conservatives. The former Red Wall voters that Boris wooed in 2019 now seem to be drifting towards Reform. The party is trying to catch them by doubling down on culture war issues, but this now seems to be alienating the party's previous base of southern suburbanites. In the words of the Financial Times, the focus on culture wars, quote, has only seemed to accelerate the drift of liberal conservatives in the prosperous South into the arms of the Liberal Democrats. Or to quote former Conservative Chancellor George Osborne, if we spoke a little less about transgender toilets and a bit more about taxes, we might be onto something. The reason this wasn't evident at the 2019 election was because third-party voting in England has traditionally been a bit of a wasted vote thanks to the first-past-the-post system. And rich Southerners that year, they didn't dare let their votes go to waste for one simple reason. Jeremy Corbyn was the sort of Labour leader that people living in nice houses in Guildford, where my parents live, have nightmares about. A left-winger who was all about high taxes and state ownership, and who'd taken meetings with members of Hamas. He all but guaranteed that any wavering blue wall voters returned to the fold. But once Corbyn was off the scene, there was nothing to keep those prosperous Southerners from voting with their hearts, especially since the Tories seemed to be trying to make themselves toxic with that very group of voters. Just consider some of the rhetorical highlights from the Conservatives in those years. Home Secretary Suella Braverman calling immigration an existential challenge, Priti Patel arranging for asylum seekers to be deported to Rwanda, Liz Truss suggesting she didn't know if France under Emmanuel Macron was a friend or foe of Britain. Remember, a lot of suburban blue wall voters had wanted to remain in Europe and held socially liberal views. The reason they were traditionally Tories was because the Conservatives were the party of fiscal responsibility. For them, all the angry rhetoric and culture war stuff after 2019 was off-putting in the extreme. So when the Tories also dynamited their reputation for stewarding the economy, what was left to keep those voters on side? The 49 days of Liz Truss's premiership may be the most eventful 7 weeks of British politics outside of wartime. Not only did the Queen die, but Truss, who'd replaced a disgraced Boris Johnson, then unveiled a mini-budget that promptly absolutely blew up the markets. Although the party quickly reversed course and ditched Truss for Rishi Sunak, the damage was already done. The Tories' storied fiscal credibility had been reduced to a radioactive ruin, a political Chernobyl. And just like the real Chernobyl, the cleanup could last decades. In recent polling, YouGov found that the public still trusts the Tories less than Labour to manage the economy. The last time the Conservatives oversaw an economic humiliation of similar scale, during Black Wednesday in 1992, they lost the next 3 elections. In today's context, this means that the Blue Wall has no reason to return to a party that no longer represents them in style or rhetoric on most social issues. All of which would be fine if the trade-off was the Tories now dominating in working-class post-industrial towns that used to vote Labour. But they're not, because while the party may have indulged in Trumpian rhetoric while in power, it failed to follow it up with any action. And it's here that we can see why the party is losing so many voters to reform. The massive recent spike in immigration. Make all immigrants learn English. End uncontrolled migration. Blame the fall of the Roman Empire on open borders. When voters listened to Boris Johnson's talking points ahead of the 2019 election, they might have assumed that they were listening to a man who would make tackling high immigration the key policy of his tenure. The same for the wider party, after Boris was forced from the role of PM in 2022. Right up to the moment they left power, the 2019 to 2024 iteration of the Tory party defined itself in opposition to immigration. So it might come as a surprise to learn that immigration numbers surged in that time period. Not just by the thousands, or even the tens of thousands, but by the hundreds of thousands. To see what we mean, just compare before and after Boris Johnson's tenure. In the year ending March 2020, towards the start of his time in Downing Street, it was estimated that net migration, that is, the number of new arrivals minus those who leave, had reached 313,000, close to its historic 2015 peak of 331,000. By 2023, just after Boris left, it had reached nearly 1 million. Now, part of this was a massive influx of people fleeing either the war in Ukraine or a Chinese crackdown in the former British colony of Hong Kong. But an even larger part was the Conservatives implementing policy changes designed to lead to higher migration. Magazine The Critic ran a recent list of all the migration law changes Boris and Rishi Sunak oversaw. These included removing caps on non-EU migration, opening up visas to workers from lower skill levels, allowing students to remain and work in the UK for 2 years after finishing their studies, and expanding the classes of workers who could bring their dependents over with them. The result was a boom in immigration from everywhere but Europe. While pre-Brexit migration waves had largely been made up of Eastern Europeans, the influx that started under Boris was dominated by Indians, Nigerians, and people from Pakistan. Remember, one of the implicit promises of Brexit had been an end to all immigration. During the campaign, Boris Johnson specifically raised fears of 77 million Muslims moving to Britain from Turkey should the public vote to remain. The unsaid part being that a vote to leave would also be a vote against non-white, non-Christian immigration. All of which is a roundabout way of saying that the Tories under Boris burned their culture war credentials as decisively as Liz Truss torched their financial reputation. As the Mail on Sunday columnist Dan Hodges noted on Twitter, I genuinely don't understand, given the salience of immigration, how the last government let net migration spiral to 1 million. What were the Tories thinking? It was political suicide. This is the combination that led us to make this video that genuinely makes us wonder if the Tories are finished. A toxic mix of anti-immigrant rhetoric that has chased away any remaining centrists and social liberals alongside an open-door policy that has simultaneously smashed all historical records on net migration. The craziest part is that there are constituencies for both those things. You can imagine a British party that declares immigration is good for growth and relaxes the rules and does well among the metropolitan elite. Equally, you can imagine a nativist party that wants to slam shut the doors and grab votes in the regions that voted heavily for Brexit. That's because both these parties already exist. The Liberal Democrats don't quite call for uncontrolled immigration, but their 2024 manifesto did advocate for more legal routes and for making it easier for British firms to hire from abroad. Reform, meanwhile, promises to freeze all non-essential immigration and tax firms that employ foreigners. But a party that combines reform rhetoric with Lib Dem policies just does not make sense. Yet that's where the Conservatives have found themselves. Having purged and alienated the left of their party, they then stabbed their right-wingers in the back, all against a backdrop of blowing up the economy. And we haven't even mentioned the erosion of public trust that came with the sheer flagrant hypocrisy of the Partygate scandal. Again, though, we should stress that the Tories have bounced back before. In 1906, to use an example from way back, the party was reduced to its second lowest seat count in history and so thoroughly trounced that leader Arthur Balfour, who'd been Prime Minister until only a month previously, lost his seat. Yet by the next election, they were able to fight their opponents to a draw, and by 1918, they were once again winning the most seats in Parliament. But there's a reason why we chose the 1906 election for this example, because it showcases the very thing this episode is talking about, how a once dominant party can be reduced to almost nothing and replaced. We're talking, of course, about the extinction of the Liberals. The rise and fall of the Liberals in Britain is a story that could fill multiple books, entwined as it is with the great historical events of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, like Irish independence and the First World War. For our purposes, though, all you need to know is that the Liberals spent decades as the left-leaning party in the British system, winning elections and producing prime ministers. In 1906, they scored one of the UK's greatest landslide victories, nearly wiping the Tories off the map. And then they all but vanished. Not quickly. The party led the coalition government during World War I, but when the 1918 vote came, their number of seats plummeted to 36. While they would briefly regain prominence in the 1923 election, netting 158 seats, it was their last gasp. Their seat total never again broke 60. For most of the rest of their existence, it was below 20. Now, the Liberals' legacy is still visible in British politics. The Liberal Democrats are a successor party and formed part of the government between 2010 and 2015. Again, though, the point here isn't to discuss the history and legacy of the Liberal Party. It's to show how a once dominant force in UK politics was replaced, in this case, by the Labour Party. At the time the Liberals won their 1906 landslide victory, Labour was an electoral footnote. That year, the newcomer party won only 29 seats, placing fourth behind the Irish Parliamentary Party. By 1922, though, they'd overtaken the Liberals to become the second biggest force in Parliament. Come 1923, they'd formed their first minority government. As the Liberals saw their seat counts drop into double digits, Labour slowly became the dominant force on the British left. By the post-World War II era, it was routinely swapping power with the Conservatives, while Liberal leaders were reduced to things like posing on hovercraft and murdering dogs on Exmoor. Today, the big question in British politics is whether we could be seeing the same thing happen again. Only rather than the replacement of a centre-left party with a challenger, it's the centre-right Tories who could be replaced by reform. What makes this seem plausible is the fact that it's already happened elsewhere in Europe. Over in France, Les Républicains, the centre-right party that traces its lineage back to Charles de Gaulle, has ceased to exist as a serious electoral force. In the 2022 presidential election, its candidate got under 5%. As the New Statesman has written, like the Tories today, the Republicans found themselves assailed from the right by Marine Le Pen's National Rally and from the centre by Emmanuel Macron's Renaissance. Such dynamics are self-reinforcing. Once a party loses much of its support, its hold on the minority that remain is weakened. Something similar seems to be in process right now in Austria, where the centre-right Austrian People's Party is lagging far behind the far-right Freedom Party. And you could argue that a particularly American version already occurred within the GOP, with the Republican Party as it exists today bearing little resemblance to the party of Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney. So, given that it has happened elsewhere, why not in Britain? Is there anything special about the Tories that means they're immune to such a political upheaval? Maybe not. Although, rather than just go ahead and pronounce the extinction of the party, we'll end this episode on a note of caution. After all, British politics has been here before. Back in the 1980s, a breakaway faction of the Labour Party founded something known as the SPD in an attempt to create a viable left-wing force as Labour descended into infighting. Joining up with the remnants of the Liberals to create the SDP Liberal Alliance, it briefly became the hot new thing in British politics. At one point, opinion polls pegged the party at 50%. And then came the 1983 election. The Alliance got over 25% of the vote, only 2 percentage points behind Labour, yet because of the nature of the first-past-the-post system, Labour received 209 seats. Alliance, by contrast, won 23. That was the group's high watermark, and it faded into irrelevance soon after. In another, fairer system, you can imagine it sitting there as a huge force in Parliament, gaining public support as Labour slides into oblivion. But that isn't the system that Britain uses. In the current system, first past the post ruthlessly crushes rivals to both Labour and the Tories. When parties do break through, as the SNP did in Scotland in 2015, they tend to be geographically limited. And even the SNP was massively helped in its breakthrough by Scotland using a form of proportional representation for its devolved parliament, allowing the party to build its profile for years ahead of its general election breakthrough. So, long story short here, the odds are against a reform breakthrough. It could be that 100 years from now, the UK is still just trading between Tory and Labour prime ministers, and this video looks as quaintly ridiculous as those Victorian predictions of life in the year 2000. But it could also be that we're now witnessing a once-in-a-century political realignment, one that will see the Tories swept away after nearly 200 years. And if that happens, then the only fitting epitaph for what was once the world's most successful political party will be, they brought it on themselves. Thank you for watching.